This is Yesterzine, the monthly magazine show about monthly magazines. We take a magazine from the Golden Age, play the games they liked most and least, and flip through to find out what gaming was like when a properly licensed sports game was a novelty. It's 1996, and that's still true. FIFA is only 2 years old. It's the first generation of EA Sports, and the first of the Psygnosis official Formula 1 games was releasing exclusively on the PlayStation 1. You were still out of luck if you were an F1 fan on other formats. Even then, despite it being as late as October when CVG issue 179 hit the shops, that official F1 game is based on the previous year's season. A far cry from today, where we'll have one based on the current year before it's barely half over. Driving's a theme this month. The Bizarre Creations coded official title is indeed our gaming heaven, being the only new game to get a perfect score on CVG's 5-star system. Equally, another driving game is the only 1-star in the issue, but I think you might be surprised what it is. Elsewhere, games get a new dimension thanks to an invention called the Internet, and I actually bloody win something for once. All this and more very soon, if one of you could help me get these racing boots on. Realism we absolutely take for granted these days. Take relatively obscure simulation Kartcraft, where incredible efforts have been made. This is Wilton Mill in the lower Midlands of the UK, and this is me driving it in Kartcraft. I've driven this circuit in these karts, and admittedly I'm using a controller that costs more than my PlayStation 5, but everything I did on the real track works here. And it works here because even for this game that I would wager about 3/4 of you have never heard of, this track has been comprehensively laser scanned. So everything is correct to reality, quite literally down to the millimetre. And you would laugh these days if a Formula 1 game came out and didn't have all the real cars and drivers. EA caught quite a lot of flack, not least from me, for the last 2 titles not reflecting all the COVID-enforced changes to the 2020 and 2021 Formula 1 seasons. But that's actually quite new. Last month you saw that EA didn't get the real teams in until their 3rd ice hockey game, and that Madden and FIFA likewise did not have the real players or teams in their first incarnations. Sensible Soccer didn't have real teams, but got around this by making everything one character wrong and giving you the ability to edit. Football Manager's database these days is so comprehensive there's barely a team in the league that doesn't pay to license their full dataset in order to make informed transfer decisions. In 1992 though, Football Manager started life as Championship Manager, and the first version of that game uses entirely fictional players. The same was true in racing. Most of the fondly remembered classics might have had the odd real track, at least as far as the technology let them, but rarely a real championship or driver. Grand Prix Circuit did not. No one other than the title team was in Ferrari Formula 1. Even the first king of real Formula 1 games, Jeff Crammond's Formula 1 Grand Prix, does not have a single real team or driver in it, albeit using the correct colours and again providing an editor. F1 GP is another milestone though. At the time, Formula 1 races had 26 drivers starting them and anything up to 40 cars trying to take those spots. This was the first game to actually include every entrant, rather than a cherry-picked 8 or, if you were lucky, 16. Based on the 1991 season, all 35 drivers and teams are right there if you want them and can fix the names, even if the limitations of the Amiga meant that the cars are just flat colours in a range of fixed patterns. Even so, this was a mind-blowing advancement for the Formula 1 obsessed kid. We're on the edge of doing it properly though. 1992's excellently named Vroom by Lancor was adapted into this properly branded licensed Formula 1 title from Domark. But despite this and the names of every 1993 driver around the edge of the box, not only are races in this game only 16 cars, one of the teams, the only one you can drive for, is fictional. If you're a kid, you want to be Senna, just as much as the fighting game people wanted to be Goro. Imagine if they'd converted Street Fighter 2 and told you couldn't be Ryu, Ken or Chun-Li, but despite the fact those were all in the game, you had to be Dave from Coventry. Which isn't to say F1 isn't a fun game. It's a very rare 16-bit game with this turn of speed, and it at least has a go at the real tracks. But what it's not is the game that will satisfy someone looking to be in a Formula 1 race. It took until a 1996 two-punch to really fix this. The sequel to F1 GP, simply titled Grand Prix 2, did it exclusively on PC. Full fields, be anyone, complete licensing, and cars in high enough detail that you can read the sponsors. Finally, a sense of place, a chance to be Nigel Mansell, although obviously computers were still nowhere near powerful enough to properly render that Tache. Console owners were still stuck. F1 was about as close as it got in atmosphere, but we needed a simulation. Something with the atmosphere of Formula 1, but also with all the drivers, all the circuits, and ideally with some of the glamour and realism of the TV coverage we all spent 17 Sundays a year glued to. Psygnosis were there with the full official F1 license. The PlayStation was there with the sheer power to do the job. And the teams that weren't won over by Wipeout in clubs could absolutely be won over by a new dimension in realistic racing. And this, getting a gushing 5 stars from CVG this month, is simply Formula 1. That's a statement intro. If you're a teenager F1 fan like I was, you are noticing several things here. That is a real car from a real team with a real driver. Specifically, that owned by Eddie Jordan, who you younger people know as that Irish guy on Top Gear you wish wasn't on Top Gear. And yes, this is CGI, but the detail on it is massively beyond anything you'll have seen before. Everything looks like the real thing from the perspective of a 15-year-old kid. And getting into the game, it stays the same. As the demo it's been counting down to plays, we notice something.
First round of the World Championship, Interlagos, Brazil. Watch for the lights. We've got real excitement coming up now. Go!
Commentary. And not just any commentary. That's Murray Walker, the voice of Formula 1 for about 4 decades to anyone British. But not just that. The entire aesthetic of the game is lifted directly from the TV coverage of the time. The timing system, the display of the gaps, the driver names, it's all exactly what you would have seen on the official broadcasts. And as an aside, I love this. Because you were buying this game to feel like a Formula 1 driver. And all this stuff makes a huge difference. As an adult, you think about this for 2 seconds, and of course a real Formula 1 driver doesn't see these graphics. Doesn't hear Murray Walker. But back then as a child playing older games, you'd have been imagining that commentary anyway. It's a huge sense of place, and it's here and now it happens for the first time. I'll confess my bias here. While I didn't have F1 at the time, it got my attention. It was about now that I got my first part-time job, and the PlayStation was, about a year later, the first console I properly bought with my own money. And that's the kind of thing you remember. HMV were doing a deal for a PlayStation and a game of your choice for $159.99. My friend got Need for Speed 2, a fine choice. I got the then new sequel to this, Formula 1 97. I still have that PlayStation, and I now have both the copies of those games that were bought that day, albeit my game box is falling victim to an ill-advised clear-out a few years later. And while I didn't get to buy it new, I of course own this now, and you're watching me play it on my current go-to PS1 hardware, this slim PS2. Starting a race, we notice a level of detail. In F1 GP, every car model is the same. Even GP2, with the power of the PC behind it, uses just 2, a high nose and a low nose variant to reflect the 1994 grid. Formula 1 has individual models for each car. And while the casual fan is never going to notice, the nerds among us absolutely do notice the tubby low-nose Ferrari, the bulbous high-nose Benetton, or the incredible ugliness that was the McLaren with its distinctive and near useless middle wing. And it's all here, to a near absurd degree. The racing is the same upgraded sense of place. Even in those first 2 Jeff Crammon games, every car drives the same. You pick the champion's Williams, or the tail ender's Simtek, and nothing actually changes other than the colour of the car you're driving. Not here. I've chosen legendary low-budget team Minardi, and not only is the distinctive shape of the M195 present and correct, the car's speed reflects the fact that it was using older engines and a chassis put together and run on a budget that literally would not pay Lewis Hamilton's salary. So even on easy mode, I'm qualifying 9th, with my teammate Luca Badoa further down the grid. These are all things you'd entirely take for granted these days, but again, they were huge back then, and the actual racing holds up pretty well. Unless you were one of the 5 people that own Namco's Negcon with the pre-dual analog and dual shock era here. But that matters less than you would think a lot of the time in a darty race car like this. And as someone who's been playing a lot of the F1 2021 game on a joypad recently, in terms of getting a car around the track, there's surprisingly little I'm doing differently. What has of course changed is the graphics. What was spectacular at the time has aged now. The frame rate is good, but the PlayStation's attempt in low resolution to render black tarmac and muddy green sides along with the amount of pop-up you expect in an early 3D game does mean that sometimes it's difficult to see cars and turns coming, especially as there's quite a bit of texture rip on the track, causing black lines to meet as parts of the repeating texture don't quite line up as well as you'd expect. It's not something you can't get over, especially once you know the track's a bit better, as I do Silverstone. But it's notable as one of the few places this game really shows its age. Other than, of course, modern high-definition TV broadcasts have made the borrowed screen furniture in this game absolutely look as old as the rest of it. Formula 1 isn't finished with the tricks though, because it's got one that even the modern games can't manage. The thing about sport is sometimes events happen. Drivers get injured and miss a race or two, for instance. Or, in the case of our friends at Minardi, sometimes you just needed to make ends meet. While Pierluigi Martini, who we just took to points at Silverstone, started this season, mid-year he was replaced by walking wallet Pedro Lamy. And astonishingly, this is also true in the game. Do a race at Silverstone and you'll be racing Martini. Pick Portugal and Lamy's in the car. And it goes further, because sometimes you can't in fact make ends meet. The aforementioned Simtek team closed after the Monaco Grand Prix, and F1 handles this beautifully. If you do one of the first 5 races, there they are. Do the rest, and they are not. But, if you like, you can run the entire championship as them and try to right the wrongs of international sporting finance. The beauty of Formula 1 though, is that if you don't care about any of this, you don't really need to care about any of this. Not only is it an accessible driving model anyway, you can qualify if you like, or not, and have races from 5 minutes to the full length 2 hours. And if even that's too much thinking, Formula 1 literally has an arcade mode based on checkpoints and time, and a ladder championship mode based simply on you finishing ahead of increasingly quick opponents in each race. Arcade mode even simplifies the physics to make things easier on you. Choose Quick Race from the menu and you will make exactly 0 more choices. It will pick a car and track and drop you straight into that arcade mode. Should you play this? Absolutely, that's not in question, for several reasons. Technically, Formula 1 97, known sometimes as Championship Edition, is the better game. But after that, the development duties passed away from Bizarre, and on PS1 at least, they never reached those heights again. The thing is though, about these yearly sporting games, is sometimes the year is important. If you're a fan, this is the last game with Simtek, the last game with Nigel Mansell, the last game with current Formula 1 commentator and head valuation specialist Martin Brundle.
Now there's an old saying, if you've got a $5 head, get a $5 helmet. Well, this is not a $5 helmet, but it may as well be if it doesn't fit me well and I don't do it up properly.
And these details are important. But in any case, Formula 1 and F1 97, whichever you choose, are still worthy driving games, and chronicles of history that should be respected and played. It's how they should be played that's important. Because if you have access to a decent PC, the PlayStation emulator DuckStation is a miracle worker, rendering PlayStation games in up to 16 times their native resolution. It doesn't always look perfect, but here it makes a huge difference. Suddenly, those sponsor smudges are logos, cars regain their full distinct shapes, and circuits the identity that the PlayStation 1 never quite could give them. Of course, it also shows up that the geometry is from the "what even are straight lines" school, and does absolutely nothing for those texture gaps. But at times you could be fooled into thinking Formula 1 is at least a decade newer than it is. And it's not like anyone is going to make a full simulation of 1995 on this scale again. So, Formula 1 nerd? Yeah. PlayStation racing fan? Yeah. Just a fan of an arcade driving game with some structure? Absolutely. Psygnosis, Bizarre Creations and Formula 1 broke new ground in 1996 to an incredible degree, and it's a huge credit to that when, given the right boost, Formula 1 still looks more like a modern Formula 1 game than it does like literally anything that came before it. A big part of our cover features is stuff that's just completely different than it was back then, but now so universal that you wouldn't realise it was ever not thus. And here's one of those times. CVG this month spends 4 pages on the evolution of gaming from single player and mostly 2-player couch co-op to the emergence of playing against many more than that online. Online doesn't have to mean the internet. The PCs, especially in an office environment, had always led the way on this one. Networks of many PCs were common even in the early 90s, and probably correctly CVG credits Doom as the mainstream start of this, with its support for 4-player deathmatches using so-called IPX networking. And they also point out you can use the then new program Kali, which basically fakes a local network across the internet. Kali did have the downside that games that think they're running across a local network are probably not trying to keep their bandwidth use down to the 1.5 kilobytes a second you'd probably get from a 1995 modem. So it was not perfect. Nonetheless, Kali was popular, to the extent that Warcraft 2 specifically detects it and changes how it does things to account for those bandwidth issues. The proper solution though is real internet networking, and that's when 1996 steps in. Quake was reviewed this month and was the other game that got 5 stars. CVG though had previously reviewed it from its shareware version, and while we didn't look at it this episode, we did right back in episode 6 if you want to look. For Wolfenstein, Doom, and all their previous collaborations with Apogee Software, id Software had used a shareware model, breaking their game into a few episodes and handing out the first one to anyone who'd take it, at trade shows, on magazine cover discs, etc. These were essentially large demos, generally being a complete but short game, and if you wanted the 2 or more sequels, then you sent them some money for them. This model had got Doom into 20 million people's hands in its first 2 years. The internet was going to be huge for them. The ability to get that taster episode out would be massively easier and cheaper. If nothing else, that is 20 million floppy disks they don't need. But off the back of those 4-player Doom deathmatches, id realised the internet would do just as much for multiplayer. They were all in. Quake can use IPX local networks, directly wired PCs, modem direct dialing, and yes, dedicated internet-based servers to support as many as 16 players in a single game. The consoles didn't have this. Yet. The best I can think of is Micro Machines 2 and its friendship-destroying 8-player games, but this required a trick cartridge and people willing to share controllers. And of course sharing a controller with someone 30 miles away is almost impossible unless it's the original Xbox Duke controller. The N64 would at least integrate the controller ports, and for the network deprived, then 4-player GoldenEye was a revolution, although for some reason Doom 64 is single player. The PlayStation had a system link ability if you were willing to cart around an extra console and the TV to play it on. The Saturn also existed. To be fair, the Saturn did get a link cable, but in Europe it was only ever officially supported by a single game, and of course it was Doom. And partially supported by only one more, Hexen, which I'm sure it will come as no surprise to learn is basically a reskin of Doom. Its internet-specific build of Quake, known as Quake World, at least attempted to solve the bandwidth issue. But if you've done any internet gaming recently, their claimed 350 millisecond ping is going to make you cry into your sniper rifle, and the whole thing was pricey anyway. You weren't going to host a decent server on a modem, so you needed someone to do it for you, and companies like Quix were happy to help, for the low price of 4p a minute. Combined with the fact you were paying another penny or two to be online in the first place, and a single evening's Quake was at least a tenner. Suddenly 40 quid a year for Xbox Live seems positively benevolent. And that's if you had several £1,000s of kit at home. Otherwise you were off to the unique and short-lived concept of the Internet Cafe. This one is really going to confuse the few under 20s that watch this show. For about a decade there, the concept of going to what you'd now just call a coffee shop and paying them a $5 an hour to use their computer to share a crappy internet connection with 30 odd other people was genuinely a thing people did, found valuable and needed. I lived next to one of the last few about 15 years ago, and it's rapidly occurring that trying to explain this as a concept to anyone born after about 1995 is going to be about as tricky as explaining the concept of an outdoor toilet or Ken Dodd. CVG this month, next to the entirely correct statement "Network gaming is the future" and a picture of now Digital Foundry top bod Richard Ledbetter desperately trying to look cool, even offer a 2 for the price of 1 at one of these establishments. And nothing dates this whole endeavour like its name: Shoot and Surf. At least someone then had a proper go on console, and one side of the 90s console playground debate has been screaming the name for at least the last 2 minutes. Sega. They went loud with the launch of the Dreamcast, the first mainstream console with a built-in modem. Sega of this era though could never resist an own goal, and quite apart from including a modem, but no networking just as broadband was starting to make its way into homes, somehow also managed to treat European users to a unit 2/3 the speed of the one the Americans and all but the first Japanese buyers got. Still, 6 billion players was a heck of a slogan, and the PS2 had nothing to compete with it. Well, until just after the death of the Dreamcast, when the PlayStation 2 network and hard drive adapter was released, and the PlayStation 2 was able to do networking properly at a mere 3,300 times the rate of a UK Dreamcast. The Xbox, of course, had one built in from the start, a legacy of its PC underpinnings. And it was Microsoft that had the final puzzle piece, launching Xbox Live not long after the console. Your reporter is old, dear viewer. Old enough that I was on the initial beta of Xbox Live, and my Xbox Live username is simply Dudley, without any numbers or numbers pretending to be letters. This has had exactly 2 noticeable outcomes. 1. I still get a couple of messages a year, alternately offering to buy the account, thinking I'm their idiot mate whose username is actually Dud13Y42069, or, most amusingly, threatening me for stealing their username when chances are they weren't born when I got it. The other outcome is more fun for others. Innovative online racer Test Drive Unlimited did about 10,000 things Forza Horizon has since stolen. But the main one is that you saw other players driving around on your map. If you were offline, then it fell back to a default list of names for AI-controlled players. One of those is called Dudley. One of my friends managed to go cruising for an hour with this AI player before realising it was in fact not me. We need to talk about TDU more sometime. It's my favourite game of all time, and I fully accept favourite and best are 2 different things. But as the first driving game MMO, it was groundbreaking, and finally has a second sequel out this year. It wasn't, though, the racing game that launched Xbox Live and put it on the map. That was Climax's MotoGP, based on the motorbike equivalent of Formula 1. Suddenly, console owners that might have had two-player split-screen racing if they were lucky were dumped into lobbies of 15 other human players, starting a trend that ends with Gran Turismo Sport and its massive online competitions that in some cases led to real-world racing careers. And also to me finding out just what at least several hundred 13-year-old American boys have apparently been doing with your mum. Ah, progress. CVG. When this show was even less popular than it is now, we used the conversions of Chase HQ to the Commodore 64, Amstrad CPC and ZX Spectrum to talk about the disturbing tactic of using screenshots from better versions of games to fool people into buying your shitty arcade conversion, as they did with the truly awful C64 port. This game is an excellent practical demonstration, in fact. Here is the back of the box for the Commodore 64 version of Chase HQ. Notice the nice colourful screenshots. Notice the phrase, fastest, most thrilling. Then notice that tiny note at the bottom, screenshots taken from various formats. They don't look especially beyond the capabilities of a well-driven 64, and that note is tiny, so I wouldn't blame your average 10-year-old for believing them. Here's a nice zoomed-in shot of those pictures you based buying the Commodore 64 game on. And here's the game. Yeah. The Spectrum version, on the other hand, was a damn good effort, and the Amstrad one probably even more so. But if I flip this footage to show you the original arcade machine, then it's fair to say neither of them are arcade perfect. Not surprising, of course. Arcades use the best hardware they can get. That's pretty much the point of arcades. Chase HQ was released in 1988 and uses Taito's Z system, and after Continental Circus is only the second game to do so. So the 1987 launch of the Z system uses the same CPU as that year's Amiga 500. But it's got two of them, and both run significantly quicker than the single one in that Amiga. The Z80 and the 1982 launch Spectrum cannot compete with either of them. And even if it could, the Z system has one of those as well to handle its sound. A trick the Mega Drive uses as well, which is why compatibility with the Master System, which also used a Z80 for a CPU, was so easy for Sega. Speaking of the Master System, it was one of the better attempts, at least graphically, to mimic that arcade. It outperforms its CPU to stomp the other 8-bit versions into the dirt and run away laughing. And you'll be laughing too when you see the box art for it. But the Sega version provides a perfect vehicle to tell you what Chase HQ is about if you don't know. It's an outrun style driving game, but instead of just getting to the end of the course, we're hunting down a badnik, or I guess bad Nicola, in a car, and then negotiating their surrender American style by ramming them off the road until they give up. It's basically an early version of the police chase gameplay in Need for Speed, but on an incredibly strict arcade time limit. The frills to this number only 2. Halfway through the stage, the road will split in 2. And you will have to choose the correct way the perp went. Weirdly, even if you go the wrong way, you will eventually catch up to them, which does lead to me asking questions about the town planners, and whether they mixed up the planned town map with the doodles their kid drew on the menu at Wagamama. It's kinda irrelevant anyway. If you make the wrong decision, then you've no chance of making up the time and will be burning a continue anyway, so they might as well have shown you doing a U-turn or something. The one way you do have of making up time is a limited supply of turbos, which would I guess be nitrous in a modern game, because that's not really how turbocharging works. These give you a boost for a few seconds, which is going to be vital when you actually get to the criminal, because every time you hit them, they bugger off into the distance. In practice, there's a minimum time it would ever possibly take to swipe the crim in, and it's often really close to the amount of time it gives you, which at least resets when you get into their vicinity for the first time. The console ports were handled by Taito themselves rather than being farmed out to Ocean like the computer ones, so we should probably just be glad that C64 version hadn't been turned into a side-scrolling platform shooter. Chase HQ though is the best part of 4 years old by this stage of the story, so when Taito came to do the 16-bit console versions they took advantage of it being their game in order to innovate things a little. The fewest changes were made to the Genesis version, which basically got the game equivalent of being shoved back into the microwave for 90 seconds. Even so, they optimistically marketed it as Chase HQ 2, making it the least effort put into a follow-up since Babylon Zoo released Animal Army. There's only one change of actual substance, that you now get a small choice of player vehicles with different stats that make a marginal at best difference to proceedings. But full credit for giving me the ability to drive a police semi-truck pursuit vehicle. I want that to be universal. Imagine those people on traffic motorway interceptor police cops in their tricked out Citroen Saxo, trying to run from police, and then they just drive a Peterbilt over them. Classic. It's funnier if the truck has a bonnet. Don't at me, that's just science. The other difference is possibly the laziest, crappiest, most pointless attempt to put sampled speech into a game I have ever heard. And I'm a man who owned a ZX Spectrum and a pile of Codemasters games. Nothing wrong with it as a conversion really, although the price of it on eBay suggests not many were persuaded to pay £40 for it, especially when most of them could run the Master System conversion, which by then was so cheap it was being put underneath the clearance table to stop it from wobbling. That's nothing though compared to what they did for the Super N Entertainment System version. It's first person. That's a brave decision, and it results in an utterly madcap game. Chase HQ was not really built for this, and you're generally all over the bloody place in a very entertaining fashion. That said, the second phase, where you're trying to take down the perp, is incredibly entertaining. It's much more fun to ram someone in first person, and if you've never played this port, you should absolutely track it down because it's like nothing else. The result of this, though, is there's not actually an arcade perfect conversion for the home. I'm not even going to address the Amiga version, because that's what would result if someone somehow made sadness a programming language. You can't blame Taito for those 16-bit console changes though, because charging full console price for a straight conversion of a 4-year-old arcade game would probably have been a really cheeky move by that point. So anyway, it's now 1996. Chase HQ is 8 years old. Taito decided to do one last conversion to the still new Sega Saturn. And let me just check my notes. Charge full price for a straight conversion of an 8-year-old coin-op. This isn't just cheeky. It's both arse cheeks and a thong at this point. But let's take a look anyway. And it's certainly Chase HQ, isn't it? Although I immediately forgive everything we're about to say because of this theme tune. The core gameplay is here, although this is one of the really difficult versions. It took me a few efforts to even manage to get to the person I'm supposed to run off the road, and it's all in Japanese, so I'm going to need to go and check whether he actually deserves to be hunted the Idaho Slasher. Well, that doesn't sound good. So while we Idaho Slasher his tyres, let's consider the review. Because, yeah, it's Chase HQ alright. The Saturn has the issue that most of the home versions had in that it's a digital control only version of an analog control arcade machine. Even the Saturn's steering wheel is a digital device, and this doesn't support the 3D pad because it didn't yet exist. It seems to matter more here though somehow. I seem to be drifting around the track more than I expect. And I don't know what the Japanese lady is saying on the radio, constantly, but it had better be how much of an excellent driver I am. I doubt it though. Because being a straight arcade port means it's basically designed to stop you in Stage 2, where your fight with the Lamborghini occurs on a road so narrow the controls are entirely ill-designed for the task. What they want is for you to burn through coins to get to that point. The problem is, this version doesn't even let you do that. It is 5 credits and then an immediate booting back to the title menu. Even with the port-specific issues, you can see CVG's point. On a console that boasted Sega Rally, Need for Speed, Daytona, and even Wipeout, who the heck was paying full price to play Chase HQ? So the question is, when it's not your 40 quid, is this the version you want to play? And the answer is no. See, I'm pretty certain this is arcade perfect. In fact, suspiciously so. Which is the problem, because here's me playing the arcade version, and apart from the overlaid gear indicator, did you even notice? I think the Saturn one might literally be emulated with absolutely no consideration for the host hardware. If you have a Japanese Saturn, it might be a novelty worth hunting down, but that's the only region it got a release in. I guess, technically, it's the most arcade-accurate legal home way to play the game, if you've got the machine to handle it. This, though, is my Saturn. Isn't it lovely? But it's a UK model, and so I've been playing the Saturn version emulated. And on all the emulators you've probably just thought of, it generally looks something like this. In fact, having tried every emulator I could reasonably get my hands on, only one of them runs it as well as you've seen it running up till now. And that emulator is MAME. And it took me the best part of an hour to beat through MAME's truly awful interface for its console support in order to get the bloody thing running in the first place. And if you're in MAME, then why not just play the arcade version, which works straight off? You could even configure that to actually use analog controls. If we're fair to this release, it's not entirely an 8-year-old arcade game for full price. You also get a 7-year-old arcade game for the same price, the actual Chase HQ arcade sequel, Special Criminal Investigation. SCI is a pretty straight sequel, with one notable exception. You can now shoot the opposing cars. The problem there being the game knows it, so even the first opponent takes a full 20 hits of various types to destroy, unless you get lucky with the timing of some of the game's helicopter-delivered special weapons. So we're forced into the same conclusion as Chase HQ itself. It's an absolutely spot-on conversion of the arcade that you might as well either play in an arcade version you can put analog controls into, or play one of the many ports that were written for digital controls. While it weirdly skipped the 16-bit consoles, there is still a Master System version, for example. You could argue 1 star is harsh for what are a pair of not irredeemable games, but they were not the best things you could be spending your money on for your 1996 Saturn. And if you're telling me now you're going to play any version of Chase HQ but haven't played Sega Rally, then I'm going to telephone the police. But if you spent an embarrassing amount of the last 20 years playing those other better games, Chase HQ, more so than its sequel, is still a good time. But if you do, the Saturn version should be way, way down your list. I promised you me winning something, and I think we'd all agree we both need that after last month's shooting game fiasco.
Hi, I'm Sharka, and Dudley is bad at shooting games.
How are there more of these? But this month I get to be a winner. Not playing a video game, of course. Perish the very thought. But instead in the much more achievable concept of managing to luck into being first out of the hat. Back in issue 177, the legend that is Dave Kelsall offered readers the chance to win a copy of the Atari Action Packs for PC, containing a bunch of retro Atari 2600 games. Yes, it's 1996 and we had retro games, in this case on a machine discontinued less long ago than the PS3 now is, so let's all just remember that one. In any case, there's no point any of you losers entering, because who has 2 thumbs, a hastily edited business card and won this competition? This guy! Suck it, losers.
I'm Alan, aka Irish Nerdlife, and Dudley is rubbish at shooting games.
Well, back to normality then. Enough retro software, have some retro hardware. On the back page this month is Naoki's Retro Corner, a channel that does sometimes have software, but instead let me show you some of the hardware fun, as Naoki disassembles a Mac Classic, giving him trouble in order to assert his dominance in the manner of his species. And also to stop that line burning the crap out of the screen. Does it work? Well, I'm not going to tell you that, that's like the first rule of clickbait. For lighter fare, how about his video on the state of Apple hardware circa 2009? I own virtually all this stuff, and if Yesterzine had been produced a decade earlier, you'd probably be watching a video made on it while listening to some of the rest. And maybe test the mice and or screens on those devices by clicking the thumbs up, subscribe and bell icons, you know, just to see what happens. And we'll see you next month for a very special anniversary. See ya!